Welcome, everyone. Morning for people on the East Coast and whatever time zone that you're joining us. And thank you so much for joining. We're very happy to have Dr. Duhaime with us today. She's a senior pediatric neurosurgeon at Mass General and the Nicholas T. Zervas Distinguished Professor of Neurosurgery at Harvard Medical School. She's been a board certified pediatric neurosurgeon for more than 3 decades and has extensive clinical experience. Her neuroscience research focuses on mechanisms, treatment of injury in the immature brain, and she's been particularly involved in directing the brain trauma research program and has authored more than 100 scientific publications on brain injury and plasticity. She's held numerous national leadership roles, including service on the American Board of Pediatric Neurological Surgery and on the editorial board of the Journal of Neurosurgery, and as director of pediatric neurosurgery at Mass General. She is also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Climate Change and Health. She is the Associate Director of Mass General Center for the Environment and Climate, and as the former Radcliffe Institute Fellow, she had explored how reward circuitry and neuroplasticity contribute to consumption and pro-environmental behavior. And this work underpins her book, Minding the Climate, which pulls together neuroscience with climate change and sustainability. And her leadership in climate and environmental health, especially related to scholarship, has been inspiring. And her talk today is, of course, incredibly timely and important. And so thank you so much again, Tina, for joining us.
Thanks, Lisa. I appreciate it. And thanks for those of you who are joining us. This is going to be kind of a whirlwind, and I'm going to share my screen. So we're going to talk today about climate change, war, and health. And it's not going to be about short-term effects. It's going to be about long-term intergenerational global health and well-being. And what we're going to talk about is briefly the effect of war on climate change, which is what most people think about when they think about the intersection of war and climate change. But that is not really our focus. We'll cover it briefly, and I'm sure there may be people on the call who know more about it than I do, so we can have a little bit of conversation. But our focus of our research has been, what is the evidence for compounding effects? That is, climate change is bad for health. War is obviously terrible for health, but are the two synergistically or compoundingly worse? What are the specific place-based challenges in different regions? How hard is it to project into the future long-term, like the time frame we're talking about, 50 to 100 years? What are the challenges with doing that? And then this is really going to sound kind of woo-woo for early in the morning, but what is a good life, and how do we aim for that? How do we keep in mind those basic things that we in the healthcare field, and I know not everyone that is part of the Climate Health Society is in healthcare, but many of us are. How do we keep those things we know that drive us and motivate us in the big picture and not get too stuck on science and quantities? That is a tool, but how do we keep our focus on quality of life? And then finally, how do we communicate this? How do we effectively change the priorities of the general public and decision makers when we put all this together? So how do war and climate interact? Well, many people have talked about war and conflict contributing to climate change and environmental decline. And we'll talk briefly in subsequent slides about the carbon costs of war, the carbon costs of the military, and other effects like toxicity, particulates, ecosystem destruction, increased risk of infectious disease emergence like pandemics. And then there are many people who believe, many researchers, scholars who believe that climate change increases the risk of war and conflict, in part by fomenting displacement and migration, which can lead to conflict over resources, land, water, ecosystems. I will say that in the scholarly world that I'm aware of, there is not complete agreement on these points about how big a role climate change plays in some of these attribution of the extent of war. There have been a few famous cases where figures were quoted and got into the sort of lay press, and there has been some pushback on that. But suffice it to say that there is pretty good evidence, at least in specific situations, that climate change increases the risk and likelihood of war conflict already, and that with increasing climate change, this may be increased as the situation worsens. The third bullet point here is there is some speculation that climate change can have a more direct effect on mental health and even the human tendency towards aggression. That's a little bit more speculative with respect to more broad spectrum things like conflict and war. One of my heroes in this realm is Nita Crawford. She is a scholar at Oxford University in the UK. She was also at Brown University. She was one of the co-founders of something called the Costs of War Project, which you see down below. She also is the author of a book that came out in 2022 called The Pentagon, Climate Change and War, where she very carefully, with very good scholarship, charted the rise and fall of U.S. military emissions. So some of what you'll see is Nita's work. Nita has been an advisor to our group that we'll talk about a little bit more as we go through. Apart from that, this is another group, Scientists for Global Responsibility, who have recently put out an estimate of the total global military's global greenhouse gas emissions. And there's a few facts here to keep in mind. This group estimated 1 to 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the military, 5% of the overall carbon footprint. What's the difference? The 1 to 2% is really scopes 1 and 2. 5% tries to take into account supply chain and scope 3 carbon footprinting. But interestingly, those figures don't include war and conflict. This just includes their estimate of what it takes to maintain and keep a military operational in preparation for potential conflict and defense. Okay, let's put some of that in context. These figures come from Nita Crawford's work. This happens to be on the long-term, forever wars in Iraq and Syria. And at the top on your left hand of your screen, this is estimates of deaths. So somewhere over 500,000 deaths, 549 to 584. But in the next box that you see below that, this is an estimate from that paper, but it's also other groups have estimated something similar. Between 3 and 15 times as many people die indirectly for every person who dies violently in a war. So the mortality, never mind the morbidity, but the mortality is estimated at 3 or 15, somewhere between 3 and 15. A common thing you see is about 4 to 5 times more. So when you take a little over 500,000 and you multiply it, these are the indirect deaths from things like food insecurity, diseases that can't get treatment, and so forth. So war is incredibly, intensely morbid. When we talk about the financial costs, this comes also from Nita Crawford's work of the war in Iraq and Syria. If you put all that together, now these were long wars, but remember that they were wars, but they were not like world wars, big scale wars. They were regional wars, but that was 2.9 trillion total in effect. So how do we put this in context? Well, war and conflict use enormous resources. We've all heard the figure now that the current war in Iran is costing the U.S. $1 billion a day. And one figure to keep in mind, because it's going to figure into how this fits into the climate equation, that the total U.S. military budget is estimated by multiple organizations and groups that have tried to estimate this at $1 trillion a year. And another figure to kind of just put on the sideline is that's 3 to 4% of the U.S.'s total gross domestic product. Now, remember that well, we'll talk about that in a moment. Human capital is enormous. Environmental damage from war in terms of resources, enormous. But a lot of these calculations are short-term. These are, over some period of time when the war is active. Maybe there's sort of a recovery period that's factored in. Every researcher or research group or institution that does this draws their circles a little differently. But one thing to keep in mind is that over the long term, war and conflict decrease a whole region's ability to adapt to climate change or forget mitigation of climate change. Like they're in survival mode, they're in rebuilding mode. The idea of building back better with lower carbon, it tends to people tend to try to minimize upfront costs. So the cost equations factor in much more than do sort of long-term thinking. We'll talk a little bit about why that is neurologically. And then the human long-term costs intergenerationally, and the costs on what people aspire to and their quality of life are harder to measure and probably enormous. Whoops, wrong way, sorry. So let's put this against what would it cost to fix climate change? In the healthcare world, we tend to get, fixated on the details in our own lives. What would it cost to decarbonize, our health sector? Where does that fit in? What if we got rid of plastic gloves? I mean, all of us tend to focus on what's right in front of us, what's concrete and tangible to us. But let's think big here. What would it cost to fix climate change? Well, there are several ways people have tried to estimate this. And it depends. It depends on whether your target is to get to 1.5 degrees warming, whether it's to get to 2 degrees warming. Obviously, the lower your target in degrees of elevation over pre-industrial times, the more expensive it's going to be. There are unknowns about tech solutions. We can talk in detail at the Q&A about that. But let's put in mind, we talked about what percentage of the US GDP was the military. But let's put this fact on your score sheet. The global GDP, gross domestic product, of everybody in the world in 2025 was estimated at about 120 trillion. So that's how much that's how much money is in the economy. These two boxes on the top come from something called the Net Zero Roadmap. This is by the International Energy Institute. And they estimate that the US, in US dollars, $4.5 trillion a year are invested in towards the energy transition by the early 2030s. So they also say that by 2050, where we have to invest this money to fix climate change is mostly in developing economies other than China. Below that, the boxes come from the IPCC Sixth Assessment, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That is the most recent assessment. The seventh one is underway, but it won't come out for a number of years. And these are pathways towards mitigation compatible with the long-term climate goals. So I'm going to draw your attention to the boxes on the right. I know they're wordy, but I'll try to help here. So the mitigation pathways that limit the warming to 2 degrees Celsius or to 1.5 degrees will require between 1.3 and 2.7 of the global GDP to get to 2 degrees, higher 2.6 to 4.2% of total GDP to get to 1.5 degrees. However, they estimate that the economic benefit of avoided climate change impacts will even that out. The economic benefits just on human health from this kind of mitigation is the same magnitude as the mitigation costs, potentially even larger. And these are both with medium confidence. Those of you who have read the IPCC reports know that there's low, medium, high confidence. So medium confidence is pretty good as the IPCC goes. There's a link to that particular report if you want to look it up. And then I just want to put that, so what are we talking about? Somewhere around 2 to 3% of global GDP, okay? And that's that 120 million figure. And then the NATO nations have committed to raise defense spending from the current target of 2% of GDP to 5% by 2035. This was with, agreements of them to, so I want to put the defense spending on par with what it would take to fix climate change. And it's about the same, right? Same ballpark, 2 to 5% of GDP for the military, somewhere around 2 to 3 to 4% to fix climate change. So I just want to give you a sense of that magnitude. Some or most of the carbon emissions that occur from war and conflict are offset by economic collapse. So there are papers out there, there are film clips out there, there's advocacy out there that says war is like making climate change a whole lot worse. What I will say is that when you have particularly full-scale wars, the economic collapse that goes on evens it out in some ways. That's not to say war is good, But this is one example, this particular paper that looked at the war in Ukraine. But when you think of the fact that war doesn't do anything positive, I mean, you can argue about, so there are just wars and things need to happen. But when you think about the healthcare sector that many of us focus on, when we're trying to reduce that, like, we're trying to do good things. War is promoting this enormous carbon footprint, and all it's doing is destroying things and wasting things. So when you think of what is wasted, as we mentioned, war sets back an entire region's ability to mitigate and adapt to climate change for generations. So you're spending carbon, you're spending enormous financial and human resources for what? To destroy things. And what about the health effects? There are physical effects that we all focus on. We're going to need to have rehab hospitals because of all the amputees, but there are also enormous and long-lasting and intergenerational effects on quality of life and well-being. So that's the background. And I'm going to now pivot to what our questions are and what our project is about. And then I want to open it up to questions. What's the rationale and what are the questions for the current project? So rationale is this. Climate change and war are both bad for health. The scientific question that we're trying to get to is, are they synergistically harmful? Are they additive, like, 20 in this column and 40 in that column, so it's 60 altogether? Or is it 20 plus 40 equals 80 or 100? Are they synergistically worse? And we'll go over some examples of that. And then what are the long-term consequences in a 50 to 100-year time range? And then climate change and war are human choices. This is the basic premise of the work we're doing. How can this knowledge that these are choices influence public opinion and policymakers? And is there anything we can do with the data we collect and the human stories we collect that can tip the scales towards better choices? On the left side of your screen are two graphs. These are two curves. So this is the temperature curve from IPCC, and these are basically the different socioeconomic pathways. If we do this, it's going to be really bad. We're going to go up to 4 to 5 degrees and higher. If we do this, which probably is beyond our ability to do now, at the very bottom, we're going to level off. Where people are thinking we're going to land, if we're lucky, is somewhere in the middle. And this vertical line here, I'm drawing at 2085. Why am I drawing it at 2085? Because that happens to overlap when the expectation is that human population will peak around 10 billion. And then the modeling suggests, depending on who you read, that this population is going to plummet pretty darn quickly, almost as fast as it went up. And what we're focusing on in our 50 to 100-year time frame is right in here, okay? So there are obvious questions that come up when we're talking about this. One is, why is a neurosurgeon talking about climate change at all? How did this all happen? And why is this problem of looking long term and thinking about climate change and thinking about war, why are these problems so hard for us? What do we need to do to make it easier? And is there something you and us in an organization like the Climate Health Society, is there something we can do to help this? Can research really lead to change, or is it futile? And then this big meaning of life question, what actually makes a good life? So we're going to spend the rest of the talk talking about those. And I'm just going to start off by saying upfront, I am not a climate expert. This is what I've spent my career doing. But I had, like many of you did, a moment in my career, some of you have heard this story, that made me switch and start paying attention and start spending my energies on climate change. And it was this particular case. It had been building up for a couple of decades, but this case, and I'm not going to go into it in detail, but it was a very complicated, difficult, many teams involved, difficult and risky surgery, and it was a hemispherectomy, removing or disconnecting half the brain for a disease called Rasmussen's encephalitis. And this is just the kid who was really terrific. He did great. He wanted to climb to the top of this fire tower in New Hampshire. Mother sent me this picture saying, here he is looking over the rest of his life, a life without this disease and without epilepsy, because the surgery had fixed him. And I looked at this picture and I said, what about those forests? What about this planet? Like, I cannot use the rewardingness of my own career as an excuse to not get involved in this existential threat to all children. And that was when I kind of switched. And I really started to see it as a challenge of three curves. You've seen these top curves here. And then this one is, I think, the wild card. And I'm not going to get into it much, but it is the pace of change. This is superimposed on something that looks linear, but it's Moore's law and it's logarithmic. So it is not linear. It's going up and up and up. And this is the whole AI, what, how are these things changing our life? This is the wild card. These two are hard enough, but then you add this in and it's really tricky. But our challenge is to get over these humps, get over the hump of climate change, get over the hump of population, and create a vision for the future. A vision that we can get people invested in to work towards once we're over that hump. And you know what tool we have to use? Well, maybe we'll have AI and it will help us, but the basic tool we have is this. The human brain is our tool to get to the other side of this. And that's, as I see it, the challenge of the three curves. And I went at it from a neurologic sort of brain and behavior point of view when I had my aha moment and made my transition, which is, how do these things link? And the way I thought about it is the way I think about the brain is sort of the tool and the genesis of everything. What is it about the way our brains evolved and are designed by evolution? Evolution made our brain. It did not come down, from the sky as a fixed package. It is a biologic creation. And what is it about that design that makes it hard for us to change behaviors that are destroying our planet? And once we know that, do we have the capacity to change? Is it even in us? Have we got it? We got the smarts, we've got the creativity, but are there things about our brain that make this impossible for us? And so what did I do? I did what people do in academia. I took a sabbatical. I took a year off. This was 2015 to 2016. I went back to school. I had a bunch of really cool students helping me. And basically, the bottom line is that this is what we came up with. We are lacking the neural equipment to even perceive CO2 and its consequences. And as I'm fond of saying, if CO2 were bright orange and it made our nose water and our eyes water and our nose run or gave us a rash, we would have solved this problem. But evolution had no reason to make us develop the ability to directly sense CO2. It's gone up enormously in our lifetime, especially people at my generation. It's gone up by 30% or more just in my lifetime. But I can't see it. I can't taste it. I only know about it because people I don't know tell me that's the case. That is a bad way to have humans prioritize something, is by having someone they don't know, that they don't trust, that they don't understand, telling them something informationally. Bad idea. Another thing we learned is that pro-environmental behavior just isn't very rewarding. And we're going to talk about that in what we mean in a neurologic sense about rewarding in a moment. And then pro-environmental decisions won't feel the same as most decisions you make. You're not going to be able to, as someone in our world right now is saying, go with your gut. You can't go with your gut about climate change and pro-environmental behavior. Your gut did not evolve, and your gut is not really your gut. It's really your brain. So that turned into the book that Lisa mentioned at the beginning, Minding the Climate, which was my exploration of this topic. And I'm going to rush through some of this so that we can talk more about war, but it underpins the whole strategy here. Reward in the sense of your brain is not like, getting points on a credit card or, buy two, get one free. Reward in the neurobiologic sense is your brain's way of teaching you what you need to survive. That's what it's for. It's not to make you feel good. It's to teach you, it's to shape you and your decision making towards pro-survival decisions. And these are short-term survival and reproductive decisions. And, we now have very fancy tools from the old days when we learned from brain lesions like Phineas Gage to things now that are much, much more sophisticated to have pieced together the story of how this works. The details are in the book. I'm not going to go into them now. But in short, what influences our decisions, including our decisions about things like war and things like climate change and things like what you're doing in your practice about or in your profession about sustainability? Well, our brain weighs choices second to second and makes what we call, again, in neurobiology, utility calculations. And there are millions of these going on in every second of your life. So you are making utility calculations right now. Should I get off and answer that email? Is this talk worth it? What do I do, for lunch? I mean, you're making utility calculations, most of which are below your level of conscious awareness. How these calculations end up depend on your heredity. So there's a lot of heredity aspect to them, but not entirely. They also depend on your whole life's experience and your current circumstances. They are mediated by your reward system, that amazing thing that evolution created to help you make the right decisions for survival. They are mediated largely, but not exclusively, by dopamine. You've all heard about dopamine hits. And what I want to stress is that we do have general tendencies as a species, but we are different one from another on purpose. That was an evolutionary survival trick that Mother Nature gave us, that we are not all the same, and there's reasons for that. But we are flexible by design. You can change your mind. If you couldn't change your mind, we would not have survived. The book goes through this in more detail. How does this work? It's not magic. It's not Harry Potter's magic wand. It all came from single cell organisms that happened to evolve things that when they had certain molecules on the cell surface, those molecules interacted with other molecules in the environment, changed like in a Rube Goldberg kind of a way how things worked inside the cell. And that was the beginning of behavior, decision making, and choice. We get to multicellular organisms like C. elegans, now you have an actual nervous system. You get to creatures like Aplysia, now you have learning. Aplysia swallows something nutritious, and the reward system, using the same kind of neurotransmitters that are in your brain, teach the animal, do that again. That was a good behavior. It helped your survival. Do it again. And that's how it works. And that's how your reward system works. When you get to mammals, it gets more complicated. There's certain tendencies, like small, unexpected variable rewards are particularly rewarding. And when we get to humans with 86 billion neurons, each with 10,000 connections, it is pretty darn complicated and really amazing. So why is climate change so difficult for us? Let's think about how we evolved. I hope my pointer shows on the screen. This is something my students came up with. Some of you may have heard this before, but this is basically trying to express why this is so tricky. So imagine a walk across the United States, starting in San Francisco, ending at the center of Times Square, done at Google Walk pace without stopping. It takes 40 days. And your starting point is the beginning of the Earth. The ending point is now. So if you do this 40-day walk, life starts in Salt Lake City with single-cell organisms. Multicellular organisms start in Iowa City. Now remember, your nervous system is being created and evolving from the beginning, from single-cell organisms. You get to mammals in Scranton, you get to primates in Morristown, New Jersey, you get to humans when you're 223 yards before the present time, and you get to the Anthropocene, when carbon went up to current levels, when your big toe hits the ground on your last step. So this is 40 days. This is a couple of seconds. So you didn't have time. This is when your nervous system was designed. This is when your decision-making apparatus, your priorities, how you decide to do A or B. It was formed back here. It was not formed here during the Anthropocene. And for that reason, our brains are a pretty crummy match for prioritizing climate change. Your reward system, you know when your reward system is doing its job, when you're having fun. Fun is the embodiment of your reward system doing its work. Now, it doesn't have to be fun in games. It can be fun and satisfaction in your job. It can be professional reward. That's how you know. When something feels good, when something is fun, that's it. So I will ask you, what's more fun? Decorating your house for a holiday? Sorry, this is from Halloween. Or putting in attic insulation? Climate change is not. Activities for climate change, by and large, there may be exceptions for some of you, it's not fun, it's homework. And pro-environmental behavior also suffers from another thing that we find very rewarding as humans, which is agency. That is, I do something, I can see the results. I see them right there. In hunter-gatherer societies, I got food. I can feed my family. I can feed my community. That is instantly rewarding. You need shelter. Your whole, tribe, community gets together. You build. This happens to be an indigenous shelter in Ireland. That's how they built their shelters, from the mosses and so forth. Here's all the way on the right. This is a stone tool that's chipped. Okay, it's hard. I have to keep working at it, but I see at the end the results of my labors. Surgery is rewarding because, you take out a brain tumor, the kid goes home and is okay. Like, that is extremely rewarding. Now contrast that with riding your bike to work in Boston in December. The sky doesn't change color when you ride your bike. You don't see that bright orange. It fades because you rode your bike. There is no agency to pro-environmental behavior. And not only that, but the old way was a lot more comfortable. Luckily, we have other rewards besides agency. We have altruism, we have social reward, we have problem solving. This is why surgery is fun. We get a whole team together, there's social reward, the family is happy. Like, no wonder, they send you notes. He did something at school that he never did before. Like, it's really rewarding. Being a physician is incredibly rewarding. And compare that to the homework and the sort of depressing, I don't want to think about it, of climate change. It's not surprising. But we also are influenced by information. It's not our favorite way to be influenced is to learn data on a graph. Like, we didn't evolve for that. We can do it because we have a lot of brain. And now, the Lancet Countdown in 2021 said this is code red for a healthy future because of this graph that you've all seen of carbon dioxide. So we can put it together and say, uh-oh, like, I better pay attention to this. But is it fun? It's not that fun. So let's talk about some numbers. Many of you know this, but I had to learn it when I, did my sabbatical. I didn't really know any of this. The US is the biggest contributor, as you know, to the total CO2 burden. About half comes from individual household-like choices. Like, people say, does anything I do make any difference? Yeah, if you put it all together, it's about half, roughly half and half. You can argue it's 20-40, it's 60-80, it's whatever, uh, you know, um, 20, 80, 60, 40, sorry. But if you average all the way people have tried to attribute this, about half comes from individual choices, about half comes from companies, industries, institutions you can't control. So it doesn't mean that what you do as an individual doesn't matter. But what I would say is that you, as an individual, have a capacity to do things that are bigger than just yourself. And we'll talk about that in a moment. In the US per capita, we emit, it's a little lower than this now because of decreasing coal. For rounding purposes, about 20 tons of CO2 per person per year. It's down around 18 now. The world average is about 5 tons per person per year. So in these high income, highly industrialized countries like ours, we are big per capita. To keep within about 1.5 degrees C, which may be water under the bridge, we have to get down to about 2 tons per person per year. And that involves what we eat. This is the individual choices part, how we move ourselves from place to place, and the choices we make in our industries and consumption. So which behaviors matter most in high-income countries? The top 5 in most lists for individuals is your transportation, what you eat, your home-based energy, your home energy efficiency. Airplane travel is a pretty big deal. One trip across the Atlantic and back, or across the country and back, is roughly 2 tons per round trip. That's your whole year's allotment if you want to get down to 1.5. And so I would just ask about these individual choices. Are they easy or difficult? Are they rewarding? Do you say, oh, great, I got to worry now about how green is my transportation? How good is my diet? Can I take that trip or not? No, it's homework. It's not much fun. Luckily, your reward system is designed by evolution to be, I'm going to use 2 terms, malleable and gullible. They're 2 different things. Malleable means changeable. It can be changed. Gullible happens to be a characteristic of that we inherited that each of us has to a greater or lesser extent. It's a bell curve, and it is that tendency to believe what we are told by authority figures. I don't mean gullible in a critical way, but I mean, if you're a child and you're about to step on a wild, not a wild, a poison ant nest, and your grandfather behind you says stop, and you don't stop, you're going to step on the nest. So we have a built-in tendency to believe authority, and that is, evident in sociology, but it's also relevant to climate change. I want to talk about malleability down below, and this is the most extreme example of that I saw. This happened to be a functional MRI study of a patient cohort, patients with anorexia. And it turns out that functional MRI, we can discuss, it's got a lot of issues and questions about it, but these researchers found that the part of the brain that lights up in most people for stimuli associated with food, rewardingness of food, in people with anorexia, it's 180 degrees. Theirs lights up for lack of food, going without food. Like, talk about your brain being malleable for survival benefit. That is like turning itself on its head. As an extreme example of gullibility, remember your history that cats in ancient Egypt were revered, they were deified, people, buried them with the pharaohs and so on. But in the European countries in the Middle Ages, cats were publicly tortured over bonfires, held alive by ropes on their tails, and dipped repeatedly into bonfires and tortured. And the whole town would come out and cheer and applaud and like, isn't that horrifying? But the reason that they did it is they were taught by religious leaders that cats were the devil was in cats, and the more you tortured the cats, the more you were torturing the devil. That's an example of how the reward system can turn something that we would be, most of us, horrified by into something that was rewarding. They applauded it. They thought it was like quite a show because of the reward system's ability to be swayed by the opinion of people who are considered authorities. So when I went down this path, I wanted to know what strategies work best for difficult behavior change. We're not talking about climate change. We're talking about behavior change that's difficult. And I chose two things, one on addiction, which is personal behavior, one on social behavior, which was the Ebola epidemic in West Africa in 2014. And I'm not going to go into all the details, except that there were some principles that were in common for both personal behavior that's difficult to change and social behavior that's difficult to change. And I'm highlighting the ones we're going to stress here. In general, not 100%, but in general, positive works better than negative. So reward works better than punishment. It works better if you get a substitute reward for the thing you're giving up, and that substitute reward is immediate and tangible, not it's going to happen in 6 months, it's going to happen in 100 years. It needs to happen now. Social rewards are powerful, and this, I ended up concluding and still believe, is our biggest tool in changing climate change behavior. And rewards are more likely to be lasting if you make a public commitment. And this is what's behind the climate change pledges and, company pledges and healthcare pledges. We're going to be blank by 2040 or 2050. So let's take those principles and apply them to pro-environmental behavior. The basic principle is change has to be more rewarding than the alternative, or you won't do it. So in the environmental context, one of the mantras has been tell people they can do it differently, that not do without. So substitution, not curtailment. And this is where health benefits as co-benefits to things that are also pro-environmental come in. So walkability, public transportation, renewable energy, these all have health benefits. And I don't need to tell this audience, we've been encouraged to push those co-benefits. Financial incentives, changing codes, building codes, regulations, metrics, having people sue you or being afraid of suing you. This comes from the political realm and also the business realm. So public pressure campaigns, that's where we can come in. Also, if it's cheaper in the short term. There's something called honeybee rewards. The best example is the Ford 150 truck. They didn't market it as the tree hugger truck. They marketed it as we can win the car crushing competitions because our torque is higher. And so the environmental benefits are just like icing on the cake, but not the main thing that people are getting you to do it for. Similarly, you hike in a beautiful location, you're getting exposure to nature. It's lovely, it's relaxing. It's not because it's pro-environmental compared to, say, something that uses a lot of carbon. But the big tool, I think, and this is relevant to changing behavior on war and it's relevant to changing behavior on climate change, is social rewards from like-minded people. So if you're a CEO and you're trying to make a decision that may hurt your bottom line but be good for carbon, this is much easier if you're a group of 5 CEOs that get together regularly to give each other social reward for doing pro-environmental behavior. Similarly, if you're a college university professor, if you're in a professional organization, if you're an educator, doing it with other people that are like-minded makes it much, much more rewarding. So I will say in this context, teaming up with other people in the Climate Health Society will make these decisions easier for you. So the kind of bottom line takeaway is that what's rewarding can be changed. Your brain is designed to be changed as to what's rewarding. Babies that were 4 months old couldn't find touchscreens rewarding to learn to scroll on a touchscreen before they were invented. But that has changed their brains for better or for worse. So now that we know about what's in the middle of your screen, these increasing carbon and pollution costs, we can change what is rewarding to us. So you wanted a Hummer, you get a Rivian. I mean, that's high cost, but there are cheap alternatives. You have holes in your clothes, you can take them to the Fashion Institute of Technology and have them do radical mending and turn the holes into works of art. You want fancy furniture, you can get secondhand furniture, fix it up, and have one of a kind. So you can change what is rewarding in light of things that change in your circumstances. It turns out that stuff and acquisition doesn't even make us happy. Long-term studies, multiple ones looking over decades of what makes us happy, it turns out it's not stuff. It's only two things that come out time and time again in these kinds of studies. It's a sense of purpose and it's your relationships, that social reward. So these are more rewarding than sense of stuff when you look over the long term. So let's get back to climate change. Climate change is a choice. It's not an inevitability, it's a choice. We currently, right now in 2026, have the technology, we have the knowledge, and we have the global financial resources to fix it. What we don't have is the will. And that's because we aren't prioritizing it sufficiently. It is not yet sufficiently rewarding compared to other choices in our utility calculations to make those choices. War is also a choice. And so that confluence caused me and some others that helped me found this group, this Harvard Global Health Institute scholarly working group. I know it's kind of a highfalutin title, on focusing on climate change, war, and health. And again, as you saw, it's the challenge of these curves. It's that climate change increases the risk of war. War also worsens climate change. And our hypothesis is that health and well-being effects of both are worse than either alone, looking at the intergenerational effects over 50 to 100 years. Long-term view is tough for us as neural beings. What we're doing is we're working on, and some of them are done now, a series of 7 scoping reviews looking at various subtopics like infection, child development, water, agriculture, mental health. And we are using that as background for these 6 case studies in these countries: Ukraine, Syria, DRC, Nigeria, Iraq, and Bangladesh. What we're trying to gather is data for policymakers, and data is the facts on health and well-being, but also these more subjective long-term things, what makes for a good life. And then for the communications piece, we intend to make a film to alter public opinion. And our model for the film is the 1983 model. It won't be the same structure or the same movie, but the model of how you can change public opinion. This film came out in 1983, which was a sort of soap opera, but heavily science infused. They had a lot of input from scientists on what it would actually look like in the heartland of the US if a nuclear warhead hit us. And it was a story about what that would look like. So that changed public opinion, and more importantly, it changed Ronald Reagan, who was the president at that time. It changed his opinion on nuclear war, and he says clearly in his memoirs that this influenced his decision to enter into nuclear treaties. So our simple hypothesis with the film and with the whole project is we can choose our future, but the choices we make have to happen now. And the premise is war will make it worse and fixing climate change will make it better. These figures below on either side are from an organization called ACLED. You can sign up for free. It tracks where all the conflicts and wars are in the world and updates every few days as to what's going on. And all those dots are conflicts and wars currently happening around the world. And what tool do we have? We have that tool in the middle. This is our brain that is going to determine this. I want to take one little minute to have an aside about the difference, the distinction that I think is important to put out there between science and advocacy. And that your job as a scientist is to be honest and objective, not to let your belief or your desire for what should happen taint how you collect and how you interpret your data. You have to have an arm's length objectivity to it. But your advocacy arises from the facts of your science plus your values about what's important. So it's okay to use your science in support of your advocacy, but don't change your results or bias your results by what you want to happen ahead of time. I just wanted to make that statement. So who's in our group? We have many people in our scholarly working group that's working on this project that have been personally touched by war. We have an Iraqi trauma surgeon who is an MD who got two PhDs in anthropology and microbiology so that he could study some of this intersection. They're in multiple disciplines besides medicine and various kinds of medical things. We have people in public health, data and informatics, anthropology, politics and international relations, government health services, and a filmmaker that I'll talk about in a moment. Multiple institutions in the US, but also Europe and around the world. We have multiple students and trainees, and the group is constantly growing. So what are we talking about a synergistic effect? I just want to give you some examples of this compounding health effects of war in the era of climate change. I mentioned our one group member was one of the people that came up with this idea of Iraqibacter. So in the Iraq War, there were terrible injuries, but the trauma surgeons did a great job of getting people through the injuries with, modern systems approaches to things. But people they saved were getting these awful infections, and they were multiple drug resistant. It turns out it was an Acinetobacter species that was a new type, and it spread beyond the war zone when military personnel that had these infections went first in the US. They went first to Germany, and then they went to DC, to Walter Reed. And this so-called Iraqibacter, it wasn't a new bacteria, but it was a new multiply drug-resistant type. And then that bacteria spread well beyond the war zone. So that's one example. And why did they get these infections? It was the combination of the kind of wounds you get in war and the hot, dry climate. So that was getting worse. So it was that confluence. Bangladesh is another example. It's one of our case studies. Because of the war, there have been huge amounts of displacement of many people onto these archipelagos that are becoming unlivable and unsustainable because of sea level rise. So that's a particular confluence of particularly waterborne diseases, also the effects on nutrition of salinization from saline incursion on this rising sea level rise archipelago, that the war is displacing more people than it was ever meant to support. Our first case study that is underway now is happening in Ukraine. And the particular war issues there is specific and deliberate targeting of healthcare infrastructure. Our colleagues there are neonatologists, so we're focusing on early life and things that happen to you in utero and in your early life that can affect subsequent generations. That's our focus. So each of these case studies has its own health issues, specific health issues, its own climate issues, and its own war issues. So that's why we're doing the case studies spread out in these different places. But what we've learned is there's also agricultural destruction, and war has caused a migration, internal migration, from the eastern side of the country to the west, and the west is relatively safe, but no place is safe. But in the West, there are also increasing wildfires and floods. So what the healthcare providers are telling us that they're seeing is that the patients come at what should be a joyful neonatal time of life where they're, bringing new life into the world. But what they've had to do in the East because of their attacks is they've had to create underground infrastructure. Nobody sees daylight. Breastfeeding is all messed up because of air raids. Nutrition is a problem. Supplies are a problem. And one of the biggest things is that one reward that many of us in medicine count on, that interpersonal social reward from taking care of patients, has been undermined because the patients are under the stress of the war, they're displaced, they come to the West, and there are floods and wildfires increasing in the West because of climate change. So they feel there is no safe place. And this stress, these dual stressors, influence the rewardingness of providing care for the healthcare providers. So this is like this just multiple stressors on top of another that is going to affect an entire generation. Our film project is being led by David Byers. He's a filmmaker, documentary filmmaker. He has a film company called Black Mountain Films. These are just some of the documentaries. He's worked heavily for Patagonia. And I met him through being kind of embarrassingly in this film that he made called The Shithropocene, pardon the name, but it's basically about consumption. And I was interviewed in it because of the research I've done on how the brain evolved to be a big consumer. But what David is thinking about for this film is filming the science and the research process, like going into the field, talking to these people, the distress that those of us in healthcare feel about not being able to address climate change and knowing what's coming, like seeing it, feeling it viscerally. And this was not my idea. I had no thought about filming the research process, but he thinks that that's part of the story. And then asking people at the front lines, the providers, the care providers, and the patients and their families, how are they affected? And basically, we're working with an environmental and cultural anthropologist to figure out how do you do this? How do you see what their priorities are in a sensitive, ethical manner, to ask people at some of the worst times of their lives, like, what do you see? How did climate change affect you, your grandparents, your parents? How do you see climate change affecting your parents? How did the war, your children, your grandchildren, how did the war affect them? And then what makes a good life? In Ukraine, what we're finding is one of the things that was their quality of life was every town square was full of culture. They could go out and see live music in every town square. It was like a big part of their identity, and it's all been lost. Like in our objective medical science, yes, we want to know about the health effects. How does this affect, the epigenetics of brain development, for example? But we also need to think about how does this affect people's vision of the future? And then by creating a film, can this make us, can we use this like the Day After did in 1983 for nuclear war? Can we use this vehicle to touch the general population? It's really hard for our brains to think long term. It's hard for policymakers. It's hard for politicians, especially in electoral places. But can we change the equation? Can we change the utility calculation about what's more rewarding? So how do we get there? We are looking for funding. We estimate we need about $1 million US dollars for the science, $1 million for the film. Funding is a challenge. Why? Because funders also want short-term tangible solutions. They want a person to thank them for making their lives better today. So it's tricky to find funders who also are interested in that long-term thinking. But I'm going to wrap up by saying those of us who can see into the future, we need to have a vision that is positive. And what we hope to do with this film project is say, our choices are going to determine now what happens out here. Similarly, our choices with wars. We can tip solutions towards, I'm not saying we can get rid of all wars, but we can influence things towards diplomacy and away from conflict. These are choices that are made in the priorities. And because we're short-term thinkers, in general, we can think long-term, but it is more challenging for us. We're not designed for that. We weren't designed for that in evolution because it was about, are you going to survive till tomorrow or till next year to reproduce? That's how our brains were influenced. And we can do it, but it's cognitive override, it's homework, it's work, it's hard. And so how do we offset that? We offset the difficulty with social reward. We offset it by having friends and colleagues. Lisa, I didn't know you before we started down this road, and now I consider you a friend. And those social rewards are really our best tool for going into the future and trying to solve these problems. So I'm going to stop sharing there. And there we go.
Thank you, Tina. What an amazing discussion. It took us through so many different avenues. There's a question in the chat, and I'm sure other people have questions as well. And I want to build on this question as well. So from Patricia, she was asking, can we say that a large part of the problem with our lack of care for the environment is because it doesn't give us enough dopamine? And maybe a follow-up on that is just as you were referencing the patients with anorexia and the changes in brain functionality. What are there studies looking at the brain difference between people who are actively engaged in the environment and those who maybe don't see it as much of an issue?
Yeah, great question. So there's a whole section on this in the book, and I asked the question because I didn't know the answer. The book is nothing more than like me asking questions and trying to find answers, not all of which have good answers. But I wanted to know that exact question is like, exposure to nature, is it different from, say, consumption? You get something on, let's not say Amazon, but, and you immediately get it. And the evidence suggests that the rewards of nature are different. They are processed differently. One of the other questions I asked along those lines is what makes people an environmentalist? Like what are the influences. And one of the things I found that there's some evidence for, there's not a ton of evidence, is that the loss of a favorite place that was a nature place is one of the things that many sort of established, like career dedicated environmentalists have in common. They lost a favorite place. And Richard Louve's book about Last Child in the Woods, I think, or something, the name is something like that. Somebody else can help me with that. But was about kids having distress from, a little patch of woods near their house being cut down. So it's complicated. It's not all about dopamine. Um, People have done functional MRI studies of nature destruction. What does that do in your brain? It registers similarly to, but not as strongly as animals in distress in most people. So it isn't the same. So we are fighting like greed, acquisition, that kind of stuff against a slower, more uh, diffused kind of attraction to nature and what that does for us. But I don't need to tell you, we need it. We need it for our health. We need it for our mental health and our physical health. So, and some people, it's the loss of it that is more compelling.
Mm. Emily, did you have a question? I
I
see.
do. So in talking about war, I think everybody who is listening to this feels, I don't know how to quantify it, an extra layer of uncertainty and anxiety, which makes taking these pro-social actions even harder because we're also distracted by the baseline, social media, everything else. But now we have some really existential things going on, and a very unstable environment. How do we sort of get through this time without losing our desire for community and to build things that are positive rather than run to safety, isolate, and sort of prepare for what seems increasingly uncertain?
Yeah, well, I'm not a mental health professional. I could do a brain transplant for you maybe, but that's about it. But I think what I would point people to is Howie Frumpkin's article on hope. It's in the Journal of Climate Change and Health. And he did a scholarly look at what is the role of hope. And I think that would be my best answer. We humans pretty much have to hold on to hope or we go into despair. But there also the other reward I get out of going to all the seminars at my university with all people in climate change is that there are a lot of people who get it, who are working on it, and the economic equations are changing. War, I think, is harder, but public opinion does influence war. So to me, it's like, yeah, there are existential issues, but there are positive things. And one of the things I would say is remember to vote. Remember to vote. That may be in the United States anyway. That may be one of the single best things you can do, and participate in the political process. Keep hope and vote.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Duhaime. This was an absolutely wonderful discussion, and we are working on getting this posted to the website. And we hope to have you back again.
Thank
There'll
you.
be more talks from the Climate Health Society during Climate Week, so please check it out on social media and sign up.